This is Transported from Rome to Austin. The Pope and the podcasts. What do these two seemingly disparate things have to do with each other? Well, of course, the Pope died about a week ago, and he was buried this weekend, and I happened to be in Rome for it. So I will be giving you some thoughts, as I was fortunate enough to be able to attend the funeral right in St. Peter's Square. It was quite an extraordinary experience. A couple of weeks earlier, on a different experience, the Joe Rogan experience, we had the appearance of Douglas Murray, who many of you will be familiar with, and the comedian, although I've yet to hear him say anything funny, Dave Smith. This will also become quite relevant. Now, I will give at some point in this quite lengthy podcast a little bit of an explanation for those who are less familiar with what is loosely being called Podcastistan, based largely in Austin, Texas, hence the title of this episode, about what that is, why I think it's important, and the direction of new media versus old or legacy media. The parallels that I want to draw here are really to do with the shifting of the old to the new, in the way that the Vatican has obviously had to modernize at extraordinary pace in the last few generations, and you can see that in the way that different popes have been chosen and why. At the same time, both legacy media and much of Podcastistan continue to have the old and new narratives that disguise and excuse the old and new versions of anti-Semitism, the famous shape-shifting disease of society. Similarly, you might say, the Catholic Church. Whilst on the one hand, the Pope was notably quite philo-Semitic, he definitely had no love lost for Israel, and spent quite considerable time, I would say, pandering to Islamofascists. Not all of them, as we will discuss. Now, neither the Pope, nor most world leaders, nor most podcasters think they're anti-Semitic. They might even be horrified at the thought, but it doesn't mean that they're not. They don't know they are, or at least they are feeding stochastic anti-Semitism, something we've talked about before, or even direct anti-Semitism from their supporters who think they hear dog whistles, or perhaps really do. You only have to look at the comment section of the average podcast, say a Joe Rogan or Dave Smith episode, or certainly one where Rogan interviews the likes of Ian Carroll and Darryl Cooper. We'll come back to who these people are. The most important takeaway is that they don't take responsibility for their audiences, what they're telling their audiences, or the reaction of their audiences or their behavior, or even to take responsibility for what the interviews are saying. They don't really take them to task. And my question is the Pope or is the Catholic Church any different? They also platform extremists in this bizarre moral equivalent world that we live in, where the nihilists of the podcast community and the moralists of the church continue to equivocate between the good guys and the bad guys, and often to take very simplistic reasons for why they should even invert who is the good and who is the bad. I find that they tend to relativize when they should be absolute, and to be absolutist when they should be relative. It's important to talk about the podcast world. You're listening to my podcast, so I'm a part of it. People should understand the role that it now plays. Many say that the US elections in 2024 were the first podcast elections. And if you have a look at where people are getting their news sources these days, you find that 6 out of 10 of the current affairs podcasts most listened to in the US are not run by what you would consider to be the legacy media institutions. And even in the UK, you find that there are 3 American podcasts, 1 Brit based in America, 2 podcasts of extremely mainstream politicians, and somewhere quite far down the list, you will then find there are 3 podcasts of the mainstream conventional media and one by people who left the mainstream media 5 minutes ago and very much espouse the same perspectives as they did when they were in the job. Rounding out the list of 10 is Diary of a CEO from Stephen Bartlett. A few months ago, the BBC ran a gigantic hit piece on him. I can't think why. Now, it's all well and good that the likes of the Pope and Dave Smith really clearly don't hate individual Jews. They have nothing against them. But it matters that they continue to propagate the myths of Israeli genocide and ethnic cleansing, for example. Why does this matter? And why do Jews look at these claims and say, well, This is a form of blood libel. In fact, this is almost a form of Holocaust denial through belittlement, wittingly or unwittingly. It matters because, in the famous words of Vasily Grossman, as oft quoted by Douglas Murray, "Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I will show you what you are guilty of." The endless list of inversions when it comes to Israel, to me, is clearly a projection of a new form of anti-Semitism, even if the people doing it don't mean to do it or don't realize that they are doing it. That is the effect. It puts Jews in danger. It obviously puts half the world's Jews in danger because it undermines the ability of the State of Israel to defend itself. It holds Israel up to unique standards, double and triple standards, that make it impossible for Israel to see a way to continue among the nations. And eventually it will deteriorate Israel's ability to defend itself in the literal courts of the ICJ and ICC, in the court of world opinion, and most importantly, in the physical ability to defend itself when it suddenly finds that future American governments do not continue to supply it the arms that it needs, for example, and also hamstring it from developing the arms that it needs. None of this is to say that the Israeli government or the IDF are beyond reproach. Of course, they may have strategic and tactical policies that we disagree with. And of course, there are individual acts that take place on the ground which are awful and shouldn't happen. And I think the vast majority of Israelis believe that people should be held to account when genuine mistakes are made and when circumstances are dire enough in terms of accountability and also in terms of the sheer exhaustion and lack of morale among young, hot-headed troops who've been there for far too long, that they act in an irresponsible or gung-ho manner. Yes, sometimes perhaps even commit war crimes. It is the rush to collective punishment and judgment of the collective when these individual actions take place that make it so hard for Israel to give an inch in terms of investigating these things properly and punishing them, knowing that everybody will take a mile for them doing so. It's an irony that the exact form of inability to allow us to do what we actually like to do as Jews, which is to navel gaze, feel guilty, wring our hands, and hold ourselves to a much higher standard than anyone else would hold themselves to, is the very thing that makes it much harder for us to have open and transparent investigations when things go wrong. We get punished twice, once for having done something wrong, and then again for having shown that we've done something wrong and that we're trying to do something about it. Much easier to simply front it out. And of course, Hamas are the past masters at fronting it out. That's why they've actually managed to persuade some people to believe that they are freedom fighters and that they are taking wonderful care of the hostages and all sorts of other absolutely perverse things, which are the absolute inversion of the truth. Of course, in the other famous expression, people like to use, the lie will travel halfway around the world whilst the truth is still getting its pants on. Unfortunately, the past few years have shown us that even the likes of the Pope, with all of the information that he could be provided, was unable to differentiate between when people are telling the truth and when people are quite clearly trying to mislead, and to completely, again, not understand the danger that this puts us, the Jews, in. He repeated the claim that Israel was committing a genocide, or at least infer that they were, and this is very problematic. It's something that, of course, the likes of your Dave Smith say all the time. You cannot commit half a genocide any more than you can be half pregnant. Genocide is about intent, despite the way in which the ICC and ICJ have tried to manipulate the law and even try and redefine it to suit their purposes of punishing Israel. Something, by the way, that will come back to bite the entire West on the arse if it's allowed to stand. It's either intended by the military and the politicians, or it's not. This matters because of this Holocaust inversion narrative. It must be so sweet for Israel's enemies to be able to try and pin a Holocaust-like event on the Jews and say, look, they didn't even learn anything from their own history, or they didn't, they learned how to do it better. Well, it's quite obvious that we are carrying out a lousy genocide, all intent and no final solution. It is insane to think that there are now more people in Gaza now, 18 months later, than there were on October the 6th. The Gazan birth rate has gone down slightly, but still continues to outweigh the death rate, even with acceptance of the absurdity of Hamas's figures, which of course we know by now cannot be trusted. And at the same time, Israel's enemies continue to claim that we are bombing indiscriminately, something which is palpably untrue because so much of Gaza remains standing. If it was indiscriminate, then we would see that in the proportion of older people and children and women to men who died, which we don't. And we would see that in the vast numbers of people who die, which we don't. And we would see it in terms of the ratio of Hamas's admission of their own casualties through various public media, although they don't specifically state the actual figures. We do know that they announce when various people have been martyred from amongst their own ranks. So why is it that smart people like Pope Francis or all of the advisors around him buy into this narrative? What's going on? Do they really hate Israel so much? It seems to me that something more complex is going on. People tolerate the exaggeration because it's much easier than confronting a half-truth or a very complex grey area, a sliding scale, than it is to simply make somebody the guilty party. And if you don't want to do that, then you go the other way and you do the both sidesism of making a moral equivalence between the Israelis and Hamas. It seems to be a part of a continuing trend of this somewhat nihilistic universalism. It's become unacceptable to value your own children's or people's or countries' lives over others. Everyone must be treated in the same way, and that somehow you have equal responsibility for all those children, except Jewish children, obviously. I mean, that goes without saying. So people can wring their hands over the tragic death of a Palestinian baby who just happened to be living one floor below the Hamas operative who Israel, quite reasonably within the rules of law, decided they had to eliminate. And yes, it is a tragedy. They feel that that is something they must be equally concerned about compared to the tragedy of a baby dying in their own country, say, slashed to death at a party in Southport. And always under the guise that, say, the Pope or Dave Smith will tell you about being anti-war, preaching non-violence and peace. Ideologues will always take advantage of that. We've talked about the concept of pluralists and ideologues before, that it's impossible to allow serious ideologues into a pluralistic environment because they will just use that pluralism to destroy the institutions from the inside. And it's exactly the same with the concept of non-violence. Violent actors will simply say and do the right things so that they are seen to be the relatively lesser evil, and then they can use it to destroy their opponents on the grounds that the other side knows it cannot lay down its arms and preach non-violence, and will be judged more harshly simply for being the ones in the uniform or with the better weapons, regardless of the way in which it intends to implement a war against such amoral and usually non-state actors. Why do the anti-war types only seem to oppose conventional armies and governments? It's why I'm very skeptical about it. I do feel that there tends to be this link towards a form of anarchism and nihilism, and that it always seems to align quite neatly with the way in which the enemies of the West have been openly seeking to destroy it via a long march through the institutions and through all forms of relativism, as preached in the postmodern ideology. And similarly, the church preaches to turn the other cheek. And everybody loves to talk about Gandhian non-violence, which, by the way, was bollocks. He quite openly put people in danger so that they would be hurt, so that he could win his moral battle and turn it into a political movement. He knew that people would suffer from the non-violence. He knew that their non-violence would provoke violence. In part of the deep unpleasantness that one finds out about Gandhi when you get into it, I note the letter that he wrote about the Holocaust, where he said that the Jews should go to their deaths at the death camps. And I can't believe I'm even saying these words out loud and that they come from Gandhi, but you can look this up. That just going to their deaths meekly would be the best form of protest, and that somehow this would turn a tide is not at all clear where or how or what. he must have known that this was absolute nonsense. I don't trust the people who say that they're anti-war. It seems to me that they just don't want to get their hands dirty. They know that other people will always be carrying the big stick necessary while they walked softly. In Murray's latest book on democracies and death cults, he makes very clear that the reason why Israel is giving hope to the West is that it has shown that a Western nation can stand up for itself without losing all of its values, and that its people, if necessary, will wield a sharp stick, and they will put down their phones and their obsession with TikTok, and they will do the right things. And hopefully most of the time they will do things right. It is not a Jewish custom to turn the other cheek. We just went through Pesach, Passover, where 10 plagues were wreaked on the Egyptians to force them to let us go. And even though it was clear that there was a movement to let us go, it didn't happen to the extent that God or Moses wanted, so they kept on sending plagues. And then it still wasn't enough, and the Egyptians pursued the children of Israel to the Red Sea, where the sea parted, Moses and the children of Israel went through, and then the sea closed on the Pharaoh's armies and wiped them out. Not long after this, of course, we had our first run-in with the Amalekites, something which I've mentioned before, that everybody has suddenly become a biblical scholar about, and yes, we put them to the sword. And we have plenty of examples later on in Jewish history, all the way from Masada to the Warsaw Ghetto, where we took a stand, and if need be, we put ourselves to the sword rather than be captured and subjugated, and we took our enemies with us. We only beat our swords into plowshares when we are quite sure that peace is really upon us, and we can beat them back again into swords. Thinking about Gandhi and where we are now 75 years later in the Indian national story, where we have a version of Hindu nationalism that I think Gandhi would have found abhorrent, it occurs to me that there is this parallel with the way in which Zionism and Israel have necessarily evolved, which is that we would have liked to have been able to have a simple, peaceable history in the land of Israel with our neighbours. In the absence of that, the country has moved towards the right. Of course, folks like Begin were always around at the beginning, but they didn't take political power for some 25 years. And to a large extent, the ructions that we have in Israel around the judicial reforms are very much the culmination of us reaching a tipping point where there is an inherent right-wing majority in Israel, and it seems unlikely that the broad left that founded the state will ever be able to return to power in any meaningful way that was similar to the way things were done now 3 generations ago. It's interesting that nations like India and Israel were forged as a nation largely from the secular left and have moved towards the more religious right, whilst most of the West is going in the exact opposite trajectory. That may be one of the reasons why we and they are so disliked. The Pope died on Easter weekend, and it got me thinking, what happened to Judas? There are 2 different tellings of the story. He returned the blood money that he was given and then hanged himself out of shame, or he bought a field with the cash and then died a terrible, painful, bloody death in that field, and Jesus came back. A few episodes ago I said, maybe we are in a messianic era, where Jews are being asked to die for the West's self-flagellations, and yet we rise again. I'm going to finish this opening gambit of this multi-part episode with a little story about the Pope, which I think hasn't been very well reported, and explains why none of this is black and white. What makes me say that the Pope is philo-Semitic? We do know that he spoke out frequently in favour of releasing the hostages unconditionally, and he met some of the hostage families, which is great. But actually, his relationship with Jews goes back much further. He grew up in a neighbourhood of Buenos Aires that had many Jewish merchants. His family did business with some of them, and they were family friends. Later on, when he was a junior bishop in Buenos Aires, the bombings of firstly the Israeli embassy and then AMIA were seen to affect him, and he showed a lot of support for the Jewish community at the time. The church provided substantial support and comfort to the Jewish community in such a terrible hour. And what's interesting is that after he became the Pope, he continued to lobby quite openly in a way that may not have been politically expedient or particularly welcomed by others in the Vatican, for justice for the Jewish community, to find out who carried out the Amia bombings and hold them responsible. I was actually at the 20th anniversary official commemorations in Buenos Aires in 2014, when the Pope sent a message as the sitting Pope to the commemorations, continuing to show this level of support. And that is something that we have to be grateful for. He was a complex person, and he was in a very complex role. And whilst it would have been fantastic for the Pope to have made a clearer showing of his moral priorities vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we can't forget that at heart, I don't think this is somebody who was at all anti-Semitic. I'm not even sure this is somebody who was really anti-Israel. I think he was just pro all of these other values that we've been looking at in this episode, which are, in and of themselves, very decent and upstanding things. It is just where the rubber meets the road that they start to be problematic and where hard decisions have to be taken. And unfortunately, the Pope and Dave Smith and too many other people in the current world take the easy way out of those decisions, leaving the road open for ideological absolutists on the left, on the right, and in the Muslim community to take ruthless advantage, putting us in danger and putting the West in danger. In part 2, we will look at Podcastistan and the way in which it has become such a delivery mechanism for the destabilization of the society that we have built and thrived in, and how and why it could be a force for good. Thank you for listening.